Hello and welcome to the Sleep Science Podcast. I'm Penny Lewis, a neuroscientist specialising in sleep and memory and the presenter of this show. In the podcast, we talk about all things related to sleep, from dreaming and sleepwalking to what sleep does for our brain and body and how we can get more out of our sleep. Welcome to the Sleep Science Podcast. Today, we are going to dive into the more technical side of sleep research by looking at how computational models can help us understand what happens to memories while we sleep. With me is Anna Schapiro, one of the few intrepid researchers to work in this area, and a real pioneer for modeling memory consolidation in sleep. Anna is an associate professor in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania and heads up a research group specializing in computational modeling and memory. Anna, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Let me just kick off by saying I think I'm almost increasingly ignorant about computational modeling. It feels like I'm making backwards progress on this since last time we talked a few years ago. So I'm really looking forward to learning from you on this today. And I hope that you won't mind all of my silly questions, but I think they'll be questions that are shared by some of our listeners. So you tend to use computational modeling a lot in your work. Can you explain what it is and why it's useful?
Yeah, so we use computational models as a simplified simulation of the mechanisms that we think might be going on in the brain. The idea is to implement a hypothesis about what we think might be going on in a simulation and then see if it allows us to explain something about the brain or something about the way that behavior changes across time. And if it's successful in explaining that kind of data, then we can say, maybe we are onto something with these mechanisms that we've chosen to implement in the model. So it's a way of making very explicit a theory about what we think might be leading to whatever empirical phenomena we're observing.
So it's pinning the theory down in a very explicit way. You said it was this way. Let's see what happens if we implement it this way. And then working out whether that actually predicts what we see in the real data.
Yeah, exactly.
That helps to make it a little bit less scary, I think. I guess then the next kind of question related to that. So computational modeling is used for lots of things, obviously, for trying to understand how the brain works. In this case, we're focusing on memory. Are there some really dominant models of how memory works that computational models tend to focus on or that your models tend to focus on?
Memory is many, many different things. I start my undergrad lecture class, the first day saying what do you think memory is? And most people think memory is kind of, remembering what you had for breakfast or something like that, or episodic memory. And often when we use the term memory, that's what we're thinking of. But of course, our memory is much broader than that. So it also includes our knowledge about the world, so our semantic memory, and also our procedural memory, our memory of how to do things. And we have kind of perceptual memory that is more based in the details of how we perceive the world. So there's many different kinds of memory, and there's many different kinds of models that implement our understanding of these different kinds of memory. There might be some common themes across all of these different kinds of memory that we would want to implement in our models. So, for example, one very common assumption that I think is generally accepted, our memories are generally stored in the weights of the synapses between neurons. What we're doing is we're changing the strength of the connections between our neurons, and that's how we store some new association that we didn't have before. And that could apply to any of those kinds of memories I just talked about. So depending on what part of the brain is going to represent that memory, you would kind of update your synaptic weights accordingly in that part of the brain. So it could be that there's different ways that we organize the networks for different kinds of memories, but fundamentally what we're doing is updating the weights between neurons. And so the style of computational modeling that I do is called neural network modeling, which is, the deep learning models that are changing the world right now are an example of neural network models, and they work in this way. So they work by, they have simple processing nodes that are, you could think of kind of like a neuron, and they are updating the connection weights between those neurons in order to learn about the world and store memories. So there's other kinds of computational models, but I think that these ones are very powerful in that they have this very direct correspondence to the way that we think neurons are interacting in the brain. So it makes it just easier to say, here's what we expect to see when we look in the brain based on the predictions of this model. So neural network models have been built to explain all these different kinds of learning and memory. The kinds of models that I build typically take seriously what we know about the particular brain area that we're looking at. So like when we build neural network models of the hippocampus, which is the brain region we think is so critical for that, what I had for breakfast kind of memory, we are making sure that our models actually have parts that correspond to the different innards of the hippocampus, and that helps us to think about how all the different parts might work together to support its functions.
So basically what you're saying is in this kind of computational modeling, you're actually trying to model brain areas and the connectivity between them. And you're interested in the strengths of those connections, and that's where the memories get represented. And so deep nets are a form of this kind, but deep nets don't necessarily relate to the brain, but these ones do. Essentially.
That's right. I mean, some people, have worked very hard to say like maybe these parts of the networks correspond to these parts of the brain. I think there's actually been some amazing success, especially in the visual processing system, in trying to match up parts of certain kinds of deep networks with parts of the brain and actually explain more neural data than we had been able to explain before. But generally speaking, it's not the case that like the engineering solutions are converging on what the brain looks like. And unless you actually care about explaining the brain, you wouldn't necessarily expect that the architecture of these models ends up looking brain-like. And certainly the large language models that are changing the artificial intelligence world right now, it's a little bit more of a struggle to identify how the pieces of those models correspond to the brain. But having said that, people are trying very hard to do that mapping. And there's some creative ways of thinking about how there might be correspondences, there might not be. But yeah, people are thinking carefully about that, even for LLMs.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting kind of a side question, is this sort of the deep nets in some sense. Some of them are attempting to model the brain. Certainly in your work, you're attempting to create a model that's parallel to the brain, and you can use that to try and understand how the brain could be doing things. But of course, there are other deep nets which are just trying to achieve a task, and they're not constrained to be at all brain-like. I mean, they may turn out to be brain-like in some cases, but it may be that because it's a computer and not a brain, it's more efficient for them to be organized in a different way. And so they don't map onto the brain at all. That's kind of what you're saying. So there are two completely different types of deep nets.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's still ways in which the models might benefit from thinking about how the brain solves problems. So, for example, a huge issue right now is that these models need an incredible amount of data to be trained, much more than we need to learn the same information. And so there might be something about the way that the brain learns more efficiently that could inspire us to build models that are more efficient. And, perhaps those will end up looking more brain-like. I think that's very much an open question, but there's still ways in which the brain is kind of the best example we have of certain ways of processing information. And so I won't be surprised if there is a kind of like resurgence of interest in brain-inspired approaches, even for engineering applications.
So it's a very topical, interesting area right now. So let's come back to memory. I mean, of course, there are many different forms of memory, but I guess if we just focus on episodic memory for now, I was actually fishing for you to mention the complementary learning systems. Would you say that is still a dominant framework worth discussing here?
Yes, definitely. Complementary learning systems, it was developed out of the ideas of David Marr, who had been writing about how the hippocampus and neocortex might have different properties that would support different kinds of memory. And then Jay McClelland, Bruce McNaughton, and Randy O'Reilly got together and started thinking about how to implement those ideas into a model that could explain how some of our memory systems interact. So they were thinking about a couple aspects of the literature at that time. One thing was this phenomenon observed in amnesic. So there was a famous amnesic HM who had intractable epilepsy that led to his hippocampi being removed. And what they found was that he couldn't form new memories, but also had some amnesia going back for some amount of time before the removal of his hippocampi. So meaning that, even though his remote memory was intact. So memories from early in his life were just fine. He couldn't form new ones, and there were some memories from the months and years before that also seemed to be lost. And so what they showed is that this pattern could be explained if memories are first stored in one system, so in the hippocampus, and then slowly integrated into kind of the ultimate storage spots for those new memories out in neocortical areas of the brain. And they were also thinking about this phenomenon of replay. So Bruce McNaughton is a rodent researcher, and they were starting to observe that the hippocampus replays experiences during offline periods, especially during sleep. And so they thought, well, maybe what happens is you store information first in the hippocampus, and then you use hippocampal replay offline to kind of slowly integrate that new information into cortical knowledge stores that will be the kind of ultimate final place for those memories to live. This framework, I think, has been very useful in how we think about the interactions of memory systems. And as we continue to study offline replay and how our kind of long-term representations are shaped over time by this replay, which we think might be especially happening during sleep, I think we're very much informed by that original paper. So it was a 1995 Psych Review paper that first laid out this perspective.
And in that paper, did they build a model as well?
Yes, that paper had a model and simulations to demonstrate how these memory systems could interact and achieve this kind of like initial storage with this ultimate shaping of the longer term system over time. They didn't have an implemented module that corresponded to the hippocampus. It was really a simulation of those long-term cortical knowledge structures. So it wasn't like a fully implemented model of how these two different systems would interact, but it certainly was a computational model of this kind that we've been talking about, a neural network model. And it showed that this idea of kind of initial storage followed by replay could be a very powerful way to build up your knowledge over time.
So that was kind of the seminal paper for the complementary learning systems, with this idea that you need to represent something quickly in one place, and then you need to integrate that knowledge into a longer term store in a more integrated way, and that maybe replay could be the mechanism for that. Okay, so that was 1995. A lot has happened since then in terms of development of this modeling. I know that you've done a lot of work building on it. Do you want to talk about some of that work, or is there other work in between that we should talk about first?
Yeah, so I would say one of the ways in which complementary learning systems could not have been the full answer to how these memory systems interact is that it doesn't explain how we learn when our environment is changing. So when there's a non-stationary environment. So if you grew up in a place that had pine trees and maple trees, and then you move somewhere else and there's cypress trees and palm trees, this model actually struggles with that kind of situation because it requires that the hippocampus has access to the full distribution of your memories in order to do this successful offline replay. But if we think that the hippocampus only has access to memories for some amount of time, maybe some number of months or maybe some years, then it's going to struggle with this situation where the environment has really changed. And there was a paper in 2005 from Ken Norman's group that addressed this challenge by proposing that perhaps during sleep, we have periods of time where we go back and revisit kind of our prior environments that we had learned earlier in our life so that we don't need the hippocampus to do all of that work for us. So this idea of hippocampal replay was based on work in rodents during non-REM sleep. Almost all of the place cell replay work in rodents where we see these beautiful reactivations of the kind of trajectories of the rodent's experience, almost all of that is in non-REM sleep. The idea from this 2005 paper was that perhaps REM sleep could be a time for us to not think so much about what just happened to us that's stored in the hippocampus, but to go back to the pine trees and the maple trees and think about your kind of older knowledge during REM sleep, and that could allow you to handle graceful learning across non-stationary environments.
Can you explain how his model implemented the REM, what was happening in REM? How did it do that?
So he had a model of reactivation of memories and learning from those memories during REM sleep that was dependent on learning from oscillations. So in that model, they were interested in the function of theta oscillations, which we know are a prominent kind of oscillation in REM. The lab was developing learning rules that could make use of oscillations in general. And in this case, they were applying it to REM sleep and asking, could you use oscillations during sleep to drive interesting offline learning processes? So this is much more biologically grounded than that original complementary learning systems approach, which wasn't thinking about what would it actually look like in the brain to replay and learn from a memory. This paper was kind of in the direction of thinking more seriously about how that might actually occur in an offline state. And so they showed that if you reactivate a memory in this REM state that has these oscillations ongoing, that it kind of distorts the memory in ways that are useful for seeing how the memory can be improved. So oscillations, you can think of them as just fluctuations in the amount of activity in populations of neurons. So, activity goes overall higher and then overall lower and back to higher again. And what that means when you are kind of activating a memory in this network is that when the activity goes lower, it means that, the pieces of that memory that were not the strongest kind of drop out, right? So the strong ones hold on as the activity goes down, but the weaker pieces of the memory kind of fall out as you pull down the activity. And then when the activity goes up, things get kind of mushier and you allow more contact with other memories in the network that might be nearby. And so it's a kind of way of identifying who else is around here that might be interfering with this memory or maybe competing with it. And so you can see how those oscillations identify two different kinds of issues with the memory that could be fixed. So one is to strengthen those weaker parts of the memory that fell out during the less active phase. And the other is to kind of make sure that those intruding memories are separated out, come up in the higher activation phase that might produce interference. So the idea was to use those distortions in the way that the memory is behaving across the oscillation to kind of clean up the memories and make them stronger.
It's a really neat idea. I always really liked that paper. But something that I never understood was, why does it have to be REM sleep and why does it have to be theta? Because you could use any oscillation for that, right? So it could be slow waves in non-REM sleep.
Yeah, that's right. So the model I said was more biologically grounded, but it's actually not so biologically grounded that we are tied to the frequency of theta, as you point out. So any oscillation that allows the activity to go up and down in the way I described could serve this type of learning rule. And indeed, the models that we've developed since then use oscillations during non-REM sleep as well. And we think that those would correspond perhaps to spindle band activity or maybe to slow wave activity, but we're kind of happy for any oscillation. Any oscillation will do.
No, I think that answers my question. I guess another question is, why do you think he chose REM sleep? Was it because this cleaning up is a different function than the just replay and strengthening that we already kind of thought was happening during non-REM, and so he chose REM because of that for its different function?
I actually don't know how he was thinking about it at the time, but I'll tell you how I think about it, which is that it's useful to have a period of offline processing time when the hippocampus isn't driving the show. if your goal is to go back and think about your older remote memories that might not be so related to what you're learning about, now, today, then it's useful to have a period of sleep where your neocortex can run and explore its existing knowledge without so much domination from the hippocampus. And so we think that the hippocampus is less connected with neocortex or not driving neocortical activity as strongly during REM sleep. And so from that perspective, it would be sensible for the brain to use that time to go back and think about older memories. Having said that, there's some intriguing new ideas and results in the rodent world suggesting that there might be kind of states within non-REM where we kind of alternate between the influence from the hippocampus and then kind of allowing the cortex to think about older memories. So it's possible that dynamic actually could play out within non-REM, but we're interested in the possibility that REM could play that role. It's certainly consistent with this, people who have studied dreams, the different quality of dreams in different sleep stages have reported that our non-REM dreams tend to be a little bit more episodic. They tend to incorporate more elements of our recent experience, whereas REM sleep does less of that. And so to the extent that we think replay has something to do with dreams, that's, consistent with the story I'm telling.
I love the way we're kind of tracking your career, because I know that you were an undergrad with McClleland, where the complementary learning systems was developed, and then you went to Ken Norman's lab for your PhD. And so you then built on this model and you kind of integrated it with the REM, non-REM ideas. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, that's right. I wanted to build a model that could actually run by itself. So one of the issues with most computational models of replay is that the simulator decides what gets replayed. Generally when we're training our models, we say here are the things you're going to learn. Here are the trials. We're going to show you this data some number of times in this order. And the strategy for modeling replay offline or during sleep is typically the same. So we say these particular items, this number of times in this order. And that felt kind of unsatisfying to me, because I think part of what's so mysterious about learning from sleep is that it's not even clear what a trial means, right? It's the brain is just running by itself. There's nothing in the environment to say we are now presenting you with an object to learn from, right? It's not like that at all. And so the model's going to have to the brain is going to have to figure out how to identify the right moments to learn from and move from thing to thing on its own. And so part of what we wanted to do was develop a simulation that actually tackled those hard problems. So we implemented a model that has dynamics that can unfold on their own without the simulator intervening and telling it what to do. So we can first teach the model about whatever domain where we want to study. Maybe we're going to simulate a particular experiment that we're running in the labs. Then we let the model go to sleep and we just set the model with kind of random activities. And then it will find the nearest thing that it knows about that just happens to look closest to that random activity. And it'll kind of go and replay that thing. And then we have a mechanism that causes the neurons that represent that memory to kind of tire out. So if you're really reactivating something strongly, you can't do it forever. Those neurons kind of get tired after a while, we know that there's adaptation mechanisms like this in the brain, and it forces the model to move on to something else. And then from there, it will kind of find the next memory that kind of reminded some relationship to that first memory, and then go and replay that one and kind of continue on like that by itself. So that's nice. So it can kind of replay memories autonomously.
Just to make sure that I'm understanding and to kind of clarify, so what you're describing is an associated network of memories, right? So you're describing how, one memory will reactivate, and then when that reaches some kind of a refractory time, when the neurons are tired out, a memory that was closely linked with it will reactivate, and the reactivation can kind of percolate through the network in that kind of way. So to me, that, makes a lot of sense. And I think anyone who thinks about memory reactivation in the brain will be familiar with that. But something that you said that I have to ask you about. So you said we put the model to sleep. What does that mean? How do you put the model to sleep? Do you mean the model learns something from external stimuli when it's in quote unquote wake mode, and then at some point it can no longer gain information from external stimuli and it just has to deal with what's already internally coded into it? Is that what you mean?
That's exactly right. So we have kind of like the sensory input of the model that we control during its awake experience. And we just shut that off during sleep and just set it going with some random activity. And all it can do is think about what that reminds it of in its existing knowledge.
And at this point, is this non-REM sleep or is this REM sleep?
So our simulation has both non-REM and REM stages. So if we were going to simulate a typical night of sleep, we would start it off in non-REM. And then we have, at some point a transition into REM and alternations between non-REM and REM.
And how are they different? How can you tell if it's non-REM or REM?
Yeah, so in the published paper, we made a very, very simple assumption here, which is that the only difference between non-REM and REM is the amount that the hippocampus and neocortex are communicating with one another. Of course, that is not accounting for many, many, many differences that we know are present between non-REM and REM sleep, but it has the advantage in our simulations of allowing us to say that any differences between non-REM and REM sleep that we see are due to that change, right? So just assuming that the only difference between non-REM and REM is the amount that the hippocampus is driving cortical activity, that's enough to explain quite a lot about the memory functions of the different sleep stages.
Okay, so just to flag, you're now, telling us that this model includes a hippocampus and a cortex. And actually, the model is based on the complementary learning systems, isn't it? So you're interested in how memory replay might help episodic memory shift from or become encoded into cortex that were initially encoded quickly into the hippocampus. So just to kind of make that link for listeners. But you've said now that allowing that connection between hippocampus and neocortex to fluctuate between strong in non-REM and weak in REM and interleaving those explains a lot of the differences. So what does it explain?
So it explains this ability to learn from changing environments. So we call it continual learning. So that I would say that that's kind of like our main hypothesis for what's so important about the different sleep stages and their alternation over the course of the night. But we can also just explain changes in memory of the kind that we study in our laboratory studies of sleep. So for example, we're very interested in kind of formation of new category knowledge. So how do you learn about new categories of objects in the environment that you had no knowledge about before you came into our lab to learn about these things? We know that the hippocampus is important for initially storing that knowledge. And then we think that there's this process of integrating that knowledge into neocortical networks and establishing that category knowledge for longer term use. And we show that our model can explain the patterns of memory change that we see in a task like that.
So just to kind of drill into it a bit more, is it possible to say how it does this? I know sometimes models can be a bit of a black box, but you said that it explains continual learning. So it explains why you don't have catastrophic interference when you learn about these. You move to an environment that has these totally different kind of trees than what you grew up with, why you don't have the problem of forgetting due to interference what you already knew, but instead you can learn about the new trees and interleave it with your pre-existing learning. How does having this REM and non-REM alternation solve that problem?
Basically, it's just that you need a period of time where you're establishing the long-term memories of the new knowledge, and you need another period of time where you go back and think about your existing knowledge to make sure that it's strong and not being overwritten. And so in our model, we can measure and observe that replay tends to focus on recent information during the non-REM phase and then tends to focus on remote older information in the REM phase. And we can manipulate the model to assess the the kind of causal contributions of the different sleep stages. So while it's true that these models are very complicated and it's difficult to know exactly what they're computing, we have the ability to do whatever causal experiments we want and make sure that our understanding of the mechanisms is right and produces the kinds of behavioral outcomes that we would expect. So if we create a version of the model that has no REM sleep, that only has non-REM sleep, then what we find is that it does a really great job of learning new information, but completely forgets old information. And if you have a model that only has REM sleep and doesn't have any non-REM sleep, then you do a great job hanging on to your old information and you don't learn the new stuff, right? So we show that it's only the alternating version that gets you the new information while preserving the old information.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, this could be a crazy question, but something that I've always wondered in general, not specific to the models, but I mean, we think a lot about the interaction between these two structures, hippocampus and neocortex and non-REM, and we think about the cortex in REM. But what about the hippocampus in REM? Does your model the hippocampus in REM, and what is going on there?
Yeah, great question. So our model has replay is still happening in the hippocampus during REM, but we have turned off learning in the simulations we've done so far. And the reason is that we want to make sure that we know that the changes that we see in behavior are due to the cortical plasticity. We just want to be able to isolate, what contributed to the changes in behavior. In this case, we were very interested in the influence of hippocampus on cortical plasticity. But of course, there is evidence that there's plasticity within the hippocampus during REM. Gina Poe has beautiful work on this and others. I think that that's an important kind of future direction for us. So our existing model hasn't tackled that, but it's important. And I think memories do stay at least partially hippocampally dependent for a long time. And actually, there's a lot of evidence that truly episodic memories, so to the extent that in 5 years you remember what you had for breakfast today, right? That's a very unusual situation, but maybe if it was a very important breakfast, you'll remember it in 5 years. To the extent that you can do that, there's evidence that those memories are still dependent on the hippocampus. And so it could be that there's important consolidation mechanisms that are local to the hippocampus that allow for that kind of long-term storage there. That's an important area that we'll need to address, haven't yet addressed.
Or it could be about emotional content of memories. It could be like different processing of these memories as well. But so, I mean, that model that you've just described, it's really, as far as I know, almost the only model that tries to capture the difference in replay, in REM and non-REM sleep, and what it will be doing to memories, at least at the level of taking into account the hippocampus and the cortex. So I think it's really fantastic and pioneering work. But I understand that more recently, since you've had your own lab and, facilities to run behavioral experiments, you've started doing a lot more actually collecting behavioral data, measuring sleep, and even some targeted memory reactivation, and looking at some of the principles that came from these models, looking at what happens with the behavior. So can you tell us a bit about that work?
Yeah, of course. Right. I had started to get interested in sleep in grad school, started to work on this model we were talking about. And then I thought, maybe if I want to actually be able to test ideas from these models myself, I'm going to have to get trained to run real sleep experiments. And so I did a postdoc in Bob Stickold's lab with the goal of being able to set up a lab where we could run our own sleep experiments and kind of have this tight coupling between development of these models and testing them in our own lab with these experiments. So we're running afternoon nap targeted memory reactivation experiments. Maybe eventually we'll do some overnight sleep as well. We have a real-time setup inspired by others in the field who have worked on these methods where we are recording EEG and analyzing it in real time and then playing our TMR sounds at the peaks of slow waves and also avoiding spindle refractory periods, which is another observation about, when is this cueing effective? It's not effective if you cue right after a spindle because there seems to be a kind of refractory period between spindles. So if you want to kind of hit the next spindle that will reactivate your memory, then you should make sure that you don't play a cue right after a spindle just happened. So we kind of incorporate those two things in real time and play our cues that way. And we've run several experiments now. These projects aren't published yet, so you'll hear about them first. So So we have one study where we try to address this question that I think the field has been interested in for a long time, and I know that you're interested in this, Penny, is does sleep kind of help us abstract our memories in some way where we understand the structure or the form of the information apart from the kind of superficial properties or perceptual properties of the information. And there's certainly, anecdotal evidence that this kind of thing might happen during sleep, and there's some interesting empirical demonstrations that this might be happening. We were inspired by a paper that showed that your learning is better of information that has a kind of structural match to information that you learned about a day ago. This is work from Tim Barron's group. It wasn't a sleep study, but it was a study with a 24-hour delay where they showed that new learning is faster when there's some kind of abstract underlying structure in common with what you learned about yesterday. And so we tried to develop a version of that paradigm that would directly test this idea that sleep and replay during sleep is important for that abstraction process. So we taught people about new categories of objects. These were insects, like novel insect-like things, where the features of the insects, the ways that the features could appear on an individual insect was governed by an underlying graph structure. So if you think about a graph, like imagine that each node in the graph corresponds to like a piece of the insect, like its antenna or a leg or something like that. And then if two nodes are connected, it means that that insect can have both of those features. So we create different categories of insects from different graph structures. And people learn about two of these categories before they sleep, and they're hearing the sounds that the insects make while they're learning about them. And then during sleep, we cue reactivation of one of the two categories. So two different graph structures that generated those insects. And then after sleep, they learn about a completely new insect. It doesn't have anything in common with the insects they learned about before, except that it matches one of the graph structures. And we find that if the reactivation that we did during sleep is of the structure that they're about to learn, that, not only is their memory better for that insect that they actually learned about during sleep, but they are going to learn more effectively the new insect that has no perceptual features in common with anything they learned about before, but has the matching underlying graph structure. Reactivation that we're encouraging during sleep is creating a format of the memory that's abstract enough that it allows you to generalize to something new that doesn't look like what you've seen, but that has the same structure. And if you try, if you don't do that, the right matching TMR, this doesn't happen. And if you're just awake, this doesn't happen. So there's something about the sleep reactivation that can result in this kind of abstracted memory.
That's very cool. Why is it, do you think it's graph cells or place cells or, some kind of cells in the brain that are actually associated following that structure and then they're being used for both memories or?
Yeah, they think that the grid cells in the entorhinal cortex sort of form a map that has this abstract quality to it. And you can kind of it's like a scaffold that you can connect different individual kind of superficial pieces of information to. That's his idea about it. I don't know the answer. And actually, our models don't explain this. So it's an exciting phenomenon for us to think about and try to imagine how we might model, but I really don't know the answer to your question. It's not something that falls naturally out from the simple models that we're using. It's going to require some learning of a format that's different than what we have. So currently our models are very much based in the features of your experience. So you're learning kind of direct connections between the actual pieces of your visual input. Like you're learning the connection between that particular antenna and that particular leg or whatever on the insect, and your hippocampus is storing that and replaying that. And I don't know if it's hippocampus or entorhinal cortex or cortical areas that are learning something beyond those feature associations that respects that underlying structure that allows you to do that transfer to new learning. We don't know.
You know what it reminds me of? And this may be like totally way out, but I remember seeing, various reports on bilingualism and trilingualism and how somehow knowing additional languages provides a scaffold such that your performance on many other cognitive tasks is actually better. And the idea was actually something like this. You've strengthened up a different scaffold, a different set of structures, and then your brain can use those for other tasks as well. So I, no idea if that's even true. I haven't kept up with that literature, but it just seems there's a parallel there, which I think is quite...
Yeah, definitely.
And why do you think that it works with TMR in sleep and not in wake?
I would love if it turned out to be the case that there was something important about those hippocampal cortical interactions or the kind of formation of new cortical knowledge that was relevant here. It's hard to know whether that's what we're looking at with a TMR nap experiment. Like, are we really seeing cortical plasticity as a result of the kind of 25 instances of encouraged replay that we had during the nap? We don't know. But one possibility is that what happens when you're learning while you're awake, so either directly from stimuli in the environment or, during offline replay while you're awake, that's really the time when there's local consolidation in the hippocampus, and that sleep is really like the special time for the hippocampal cortical interactions to happen and for the hippocampus to help the cortex to build up a more abstract version of those memories that connects more to existing knowledge. So I think some of the magic could be happening in that kind of change in format as you go from hippocampus to cortex. Really, all of the modern ways of thinking about systems consolidation would say the nature of the memory is actually changing as it becomes more reliant on cortex and less reliant on the hippocampus. There's something different about the way that information is represented in cortex, or maybe more opportunities to see how it's, connected to other things that you know from the world. And that means that the way that you retrieve that information, what you can use it for, is actually like qualitatively different after that process.
I think that I buy into that anyway, that I think something is different about the replay in sleep. And there are lots of possibilities, but is it just those 25 replays in a nap? Well, in our work, we very much found that replaying things, triggering things a limited number of times during sleep seems to lead to a process that unfolds over maybe the next 30 days or so. I would argue that replay in non-REM sleep is tagging those memories, and then they continue to replay the next night and probably every night for quite a while. And they probably replay quite a lot. And so the fact that they were tagged and that process continues to unfold over time is where you are getting the real effects and the real strengthening. Maybe you're only testing them right after the nap. I don't know how much you're following them.
That's right. In this case, it was right after the nap. And so you can wonder whether we've done enough at that point to result in cortical learning. But I completely agree that like this TMR manipulation could have longer term cortical plasticity effects, and you might expect, larger changes when you come back a month later. Yeah.
And it's probably, even though you're doing your TMR in non-REM, it's very likely that tagging means they will be replayed in REM as well. So you'll get kind of the tagging of synapses and then the actual translation of proteins happening in REM to strengthen those synapses. Yeah, very, very cool stuff. So you mentioned another study where you have kind of recently learned memories and remotely learned memories, and you're using TMR to interleave the reactivation of those. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So our model that I described says that there is something very important about going back and forth between learning new, helping the cortex to establish the traces of, brand new memories in cortex, and then going back into your existing cortical knowledge and thinking about that. And we're not the only people who have proposed that would be important. There have been other theoretical frameworks that have said that should be important. So we had proposed in our model that this was an alternation between non-REM and REM, but I mentioned that there's some evidence now that this might also be happening within non-REM sleep, that you go back and forth between new and old memories. And we thought we would try to create this kind of interleaving with TMR to see if we could observe the kinds of integration effects that our model and others would predict. So because TMR is better developed in non-REM sleep, we decided to start by doing this alternation within non-REM. But, ultimately we have this hypothesis that endogenously it would be a kind of a non-REM REM alternation. And so that kind of remains to be explored. But for now, what we did is we taught people again about categories of objects. In this case, they were novel satellites with different parts. And we create like hierarchical structures of these categories. And we have people learn about them extensively over a few days. They really learn about all the parts and the names of these satellites. And then we have them come back a week or two later and learn about some new satellites that are members of the categories that they already know, but come from like a different branch of the hierarchy. And then, while they're doing this learning, they're hearing the spoken names of the satellites. So that's going to allow us to cue the individual satellites during sleep. And then we have different TMR conditions. So in one condition, we will interleave playing the names of the new satellites and the old satellites. So this is actually a within subjects manipulation across categories. So we choose one category and we say, for this category, we're going to go back and forth between the new and the old objects. For another category, we're only going to cue the new objects. And for the third category, we leave it alone. No cueing. And then at the end, we do a sorting task where we give them all the names and we just say like, arrange these names however you feel. And the question is, are they going to arrange the names based on when they learned the information? So like 2 weeks ago versus today? Or are they going to arrange the names based on the category structure? So are they going to put the names that are, from the old categories that they know about, right, with those old category?
And what do they do?
They only in the interleaved condition. So only when we go back and forth in our TMR between the new and the old satellites do they group by category structure, right? So they pull the new satellites into that existing category structure instead of grouping by context, which is what they tend to do. So with awake exposure, and actually in this case, we have a experiment where we ran the interleave learning, but just while they were awake, right? And then we find that the other TMR, so no TMR, only TMRing the new things, doing this while you're awake, none of those things does it. People will always group by when you learn the information, except if you interleave the TMR, in which case they will group by category.
Oh, that is so interesting. That is very cool. And were they aware? Did you ask them if they were aware of the TMR cues in sleep at all?
I think we had 1 or 2 people maybe who reported that they were aware and they were excluded from analyses.
Okay. So unaware, this is just pure. That's very cool. That's very different than any kind of experimental design I've heard of before. It's very creative. I love that.
Yeah, it's very, this was Bryn Sherman's work. She's a postdoc in the lab. It was a heroic experiment because you have to, it's like 3 days of initial training, then bring them back 2 weeks later, then do a whole day of a nap study. So it was a big thing, but it's something we've been thinking about for a long time, how to create this model of remote knowledge and then understand the kind of integration of new information into that older knowledge that's hopefully at least partially cortically consolidated already.
It sounds amazing. But I noticed that now, for now, we are kind of coming to the end. So let me ask you, is there something that I should have asked you?
So I told you about kind of one style of computational model that we have been using in the lab that we think is very useful for thinking about how we can autonomously replay memories offline, how these brain areas can interact and do useful learning, even when you have no exposure, no information at all coming in from your environment. And we are also building models that are more abstract and more in line with the kinds of developments that are happening in machine learning now. And the reason that we are interested in this is because, well, first of all, these machine learning models, many of them actually use replay for their engineering applications, which is very intriguing and suggests to us that the utility of replay for the brain might be relevant to these models as well, even for their engineering applications. But also these models are just very good at kind of simulating learning at scale. So you can give them like real visual input. We tend to like hand code these very abstract versions of our stimuli to input to the models I've been talking about so far. But And wouldn't it be nice if we could just like actually show a real image to one of these models, the same image that a participant sees, right? Instead of like trying to decide how to hand code kind of toy features of these things. So we're interested in kind of leveraging the power of these new techniques to explain richer patterns of data in a more kind of like naturalistic way. So we're trying to both like work from these like more biologically grounded models and build them up, but also to kind of work backwards from the like already very effective machine learning style models and try to build in mechanisms that are a little bit more biologically plausible that would allow us to explain some of the interesting patterns that we see in behavioral change across sleep. So, for example, there is a class of models called variational autoencoders that can generate replay from a kind of internal representation that they have, but they don't really learn from their own replay in the way that we have been talking about and we think is happening in the brain. And so one of our projects involves kind of changing the way that learning happens from replay in these models so that it can actually learn from its own replay more like how we think is happening in the brain. And we show that that can explain the memory benefits of replay as we see in our experiments. So that's one example of what we're thinking about. Now we're also building models that take more seriously this like sequential nature of replays. So I've been telling you about these like objects and kind of I'm using this word replay for the reinstatement of these objects. There are many people in this field who wouldn't even be comfortable with me using the word replay for that kind of reactivation of a static object. In the rodent literature, when we talk about replay, it's really like the reactivation of a whole sequential trajectory. And the models that I've talked about so far, including the machine learning style model, they're really not set up to handle sequences very well, but there are other models that are set up to handle sequences very well. And so we have another line of work where we are using, models that are designed to handle memory sequences to really explain the detailed characteristics of forward and backward replay and the differences between awake and sleep replay, mostly from the rodent literature, but also from the kind of exciting new MEG human replay literature, and develop an account of how all these different kinds of replay characteristics emerge and how they contribute to memory change. There's been a kind of dominant paradigm recently for thinking about especially backward replay in the literature right now, which is that like backward replay from a reward location. When an animal reaches a reward in a maze, we see a lot of replay backward from that location, and that people have thought, well, perhaps the animal could use that to update their understanding of kind of what led to the reward. So you kind of go backwards from the reward and you say, oh, this was the trajectory that got me here. So let me kind of update the value of those states that led to the reward. And people have built beautiful models that use that backward replay to explain that kind of value updating or reinforcement learning kind of process. And we show that those kinds of dynamics emerge really naturally just from a very simple memory-focused account. We're thinking about different ways that replay is useful for memory, even in situations where the field has wanted to kind of interpret these replay dynamics differently. We think that this memory-focused way of thinking about replay is still very useful and will be fruitful.
It sounds super exciting. I feel like I should have asked you first about what you're currently doing, because I made you talk about all the kind of old historical stuff. But I think using some of the more recent developments in deep nets and RNNs and variational autoencoders and whatever to try and crack some of these problems sounds super exciting. Thank you so much for telling me about this.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really fun discussion.
You've been listening to the Sleep Science Podcast with me, Penny Lewis, and our guest scientist, Dr. Anna Schapiro from the University of Pennsylvania. If you want more information, please look up this episode on our Buzzsprout website. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to like us on social media. From me and all of us here at the NAPS Lab in Cardiff, UK, take care and sleep well.